Here you go. You're up.
All right, great. Hello and welcome to everyone. My name's Teri Ellen Cross Davis. I am a poet and the poetry coordinator of the Folger Shakespeare Library and the poetry curator for the Obi Hardison Poetry Series there. And I run the poetry programs. I'm also a Cave Canem Fellow, and I'm happy to have you here this Sunday, taking time out of your weekend to be with us. I want to start off by thanking Dennis Brownlee and the African American Irish Diaspora Network, Maria Deasy and Brendan Costello and Irish American Writers and Artists Incorporated. And also, I believe we have Nick Quaith, the head of cultural affairs at the Irish Consulate in New York City with us today. So I want to thank the Irish Consulate for all of their incredible work and support in making this seminar possible. And I'd like to open the floor for Nick Quaith, if you'd like to join us just to say a few words, if that's possible.
Sorry, Teri, I believe Nick was going to be speaking during the workshop.
Okay, well, no worries, no worries. So right now,
I'll say hi. Thanks, Teri.
Thanks.
I just say hi, everyone. Great to be here. And I'll say a few more words at the beginning of the workshop, but looking forward to this seminar and thanks for being here. It's great to see you all.
Well, and thank you for being with us, Nick. And thank you all again, everyone, for joining us today. So first off, I wanted to introduce our panel. Right up front, you'll see our panel. We have Ireland Professor of Poetry, Paula Meehan, Cave Canem Fellow and Appalachian poet Remica Bingham-Risher, and Kyle Betit, Senior Geologist with Ancestry Pro Genealogist, sorry, it's all coming together, and Noah Lapidus. So first, I'd like to also read their bios so you get a little understanding of why we have them on this panel for today. So Paula Meehan was born in Dublin, where she still lives. She studied at Trinity College Dublin and at Eastern Washington University in the US. She's published 7 collections of poetry, which have received both popular and critical acclaim. She's moderated workshops in the community, in prisons, and recovery programs, and has worked extensively with emerging poets inside and outside of universities. She's received the Butler Literary Award for Poetry, presented by the Irish American Cultural Institute, the Martin Tonder Award for Literature, the Dennis Devlin Award of the Irish Arts Council for Dharmakaya, the Lawrence O'Shaughnessy Award for Poetry, and more. She was honored with election to Asadana, the Irish Academy of the Arts in 1996. She was Ireland Professor of Poetry from 2013 to 2016. And she's had public lectures on community, family, selfhood, and so much more, published by UCD Press. And so we're so excited to have her here today. Next up, we have Remica Bingham-Risher, who's a native of Phoenix, Arizona. She is an alumna of Old Dominion University and Bennington College. She's a Cave Canem Fellow, yay, Cave Canem, an Appalachian poet. Among other journals, her work has been published in the New York Times, the Writer's Chronicle, New Letters, Callaloo, and Essence. She's the author of Conversions, winner of the Naomi Long Madgett Poetry Award, What We Ask of Flesh, shortlisted for the Hurston Wright Award, and Starlight and Era in 2017, which was the winner of the Diode Editions Book Award. Her newest work and first book of prose, Soul Culture, Black Poets, Books and Questions That Grew Me Up, was published by Beacon Press this year. She's currently the Director of Quality Enhancement Plan Initiatives at Old Dominion University and resides in Norfolk, Virginia with her husband and children. Next up, we have Noah Lapidus. Noah is a licensed attorney with a BA and a JD from Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts. He has been credited on CBS's A Dream Delivered, NBC's Roots Less Traveled, and ITV's DNA Journey and Empire's Child. Noah worked as a resident genealogist for the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project, where he identified descendants of Jim Crow-era lynching victims and helped them pursue reconciliation. He has worked for the Library of Congress and the United States Senate. He has collaborated with the Equal Justice Initiative, and he briefly practiced whistleblower law before joining Ancestry in 2021. Next up is Kyle Betit. Kyle is a genealogist, ancestral travel expert, teacher, and mentor, specializing in Ireland, Poland, Eastern Europe, Russia, French-speaking countries, Switzerland, Canada, and the list goes on, which makes me just wonder, where is he not a specialist for? And he works with religious records, immigration, genetic genealogy, and adoption research. Kyle manages Ancestry Pro Genealogist Heritage Travel Program, which he started with colleagues in 2017. The Heritage Travel Program includes custom guided heritage tours, ancestral home visits, group tours, and genealogy and ocean river cruises. So just thank you to our fine panelists for joining us today. And just as a note, as we begin this conversation, please know that we are open and we are excited for any of your questions for our audience members out there. So please use that Q&A box and type in your question and we will do our best to get to it. So first off, I want to go with our genealogists. First off, let's go with Kyle. And Kyle and then Noah, if you can just give us a little bit more about your speciality and how you encountered this work in terms of being a genealogist and what nuggets you might be able to share with us today.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. I came to genealogy by way of my grandmother, which I think is a pretty common theme among genealogists. Growing up, she was very interested in genealogy. So I've been a professional genealogist for about 30 years. I'm here in Salt Lake City, which is kind of the center of the genealogy world with the family history library that we have here. And I was one of the founders of Pro Genealogists, which is the professional services arm of Ancestry. And like you said, among my specialties, the primary one is Ireland and tracing Irish immigrants. And really, as an American, I focused on helping people to get that specific place of origin that their ancestors came from, you know, down to the county and then the parish and the townland level, which then allows them a rich experience of a really local place and hopefully being able to travel there. And then over the years have worked a lot with being a lead research manager for the Who Do You Think You Are TV series that we have in the US and taking celebrities like Sean Hayes and Rosie O'Donnell and Megan Mullally on journeys with their Irish ancestors. So that's sort of a brief story of my life in genealogy.
Thank you. And so Noah, if we could have you chime in and give us a little bit about
Sure.
how you got to genealogy and more.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. I started out with a school project, as did many of my colleagues, and freelanced all my way through college. And then in college, I started working for the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project. They were based out of Northeastern Law School. And this is the project where we help descendants of lynching victims find some sort of reconciliation, whether it be a police apology, erecting a marker, so on and so forth. Well, I was so entranced by this project that I decided I had to go to law school. So was not planning to be an attorney, but it was actually my commitment to genealogy that led me to this. And so I continued, I decided to practice law for a year after I graduated. I decided I'd given too much time to this whole law thing to not do it. But ultimately, I realized, I could either be a mediocre attorney or an excellent genealogist. And this is how I was going to help people, because I truly think there is fulfillment in what I do. So I'm a specialist in Black American genealogy. I figured that at some point I could dive deep into the methodology for, how to trace your ancestors as a Black American. For what is most challenging to folks is sort of getting to the antebellum era, getting over that emancipation era hump, because you trace your family in a whole different way before then. But the other thing that, I was hoping to talk about today is how, as a Black American, you can identify your Irish roots. I couldn't tell you a thing about tracing your Irish roots once you've identified that Irish ancestor, but I can tell you how to identify that Irish ancestor if you have one. So,
Well, I think that's a perfect place to start. I mean, I think that's like the connective tissue between all of this. I know at one point I've read different statistics on on Irish ancestry for African Americans. I read at one point that almost 40% of Black people might have Irish ancestry. I know when you and I spoke before, we said it's almost like 1/4% of Black ancestry is European. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how do, and I know as a poet who's tried to do some research on my own, including a trip to the National Archives, you hit that hump. You hit that Civil War hump. How do you get past that?
Yep. So first of all, stop me when you're ready, because I can talk about this all day. This is my job because it's my passion, right? I would say, so you're right. They say that about 25% of the average African American genome nowadays is European. So when we're looking back in time, it's important to remember that about 10% of Black folks before emancipation were free people of color, right? So, and in those circumstances, we use an entirely different set of resources. We're looking at the resources we use to trace white families. We're looking at federal census records. We're looking at probate records, their own probate records and deeds, stuff like that. And then there are niche circumstances where you find out that a client's ancestors were enslaved by indigenous folk in Oklahoma, and those have their own resources that we look at. But in the ordinary circumstance, a client comes to us and maybe they know their grandparents' names. That gets us back to the early 1900s. Maybe they know their great-grandparents' names. That gets us back to Reconstruction era. But as you said, the brick wall is always Reconstruction era emancipation. So how do you trace your family before emancipation? The rule, the methodology is you have to identify their family's former enslaver. Why? Free folk, they are enumerated in antebellum census records. They appear in these vital records, so on and so forth. Enslaved people, they were viewed as property, right? And so they appear in documents of transaction, deeds between enslavers, in estate records, wherein one enslaver devises someone's ancestor to their child, right? So it's an entirely different record collection. But so how do you get to that point? How do you identify these potential enslavers? That's the first question. Well, the first thing you want to do, look at the 1870 and 1880 federal census. This is the first census wherein newly freed people were enumerated. The difficulty here is that surnames fluctuated for newly freed people, right? So maybe they took the name of their first enslaver, and then later on they decided to take the name of their last enslaver. By the way, freed folk took all sorts of surnames from all sorts of places, not just from their former enslaver. But right, so how do you identify your family in the 1870 and 1880 census, given that their surnames might have fluctuated? Well, what you do is you forget about surnames if you run into this issue. You focus on first names. You know that Jim was born in 1868 to John and Sarah, right? And you know that they lived in Jefferson County, Alabama, which by the way is where I'm from. And so what you do is you plug in all that info you know into Ancestry search form, and you see what results you get. You may get a couple, but the odds of there being more than several people who fit this characteristic, this description is unlikely. But anyways, you look at all the records, and then you find out, okay, well, this Jim had a sister Dave, had a brother Dave, and I know that my Jim had a brother Dave, and this Jim had a sister Sarah, and I know that my Jim had a sister Sarah, so on and so forth. So that's how you do it if you run into that issue. It's another good idea to look at Reconstruction era vital records, the main one being marriage records. Most states did not record deaths back then. Because marriage records, they include witnesses and bondsmen, and these oftentimes are your ancestors' relatives or they're your ancestors' former enslaver, I've seen. The problem state in this regard is South Carolina, which did not record marriages until recently relative to the other states. There's state-specific collections you want to look at. If you're in Georgia, you definitely look at tax records. Some of these records, they have 1867 tax records, and you'll find your ancestor, and it'll list who their employer was. Well, it was very often the case that immediately after emancipation, you continued working for your former enslaver. So if you find on these tax lists that in 1867, my ancestor worked for so-and-so, then there's a very good chance that that person also enslaved your ancestor. The other collection that's very important for this reason is the Freedmen's Bureau collection of records, which are newly indexed on Ancestry. And it includes many different documents. One of the most important ones is the labor contract, because these will tell you They will tell you who your ancestor worked for if you're lucky enough to find your ancestor in these labor contracts. There are other collections. There are Freedmen's Bank applications, which can be a gold mine. There are Civil War pension records that either your ancestor who served or their spouse might have filled out, and these are gold mines. You have to order these if you find them. But anyways, what you're doing at this point is you're building a list of potential enslavers. The most important record, again, is census records. Why? Because on census records, you can see who your family lives next to. Well, even if they didn't continue working for their former enslaver after emancipation, odds are they continued residing near their former enslaver. So if you're looking at the 1870 census record, you see there's a white family enumerated right next to your ancestors, and that white family shares your ancestor's surname 9 times out of 10. They are either your ancestor's enslaver or one of their relatives enslaved your ancestors. But let's say they're a white family and they don't share your ancestor's surname and they lived right next door. Very good chance they enslaved your ancestors. So you add them to this list. You're building a list. Once you have your list of potential enslavers, the next step, you want to look at 1850 and 1860 federal slave schedules. These did not list enslaved people by name. However, they listed enslaved people by gender and age. So you want to look at this potential list of enslavers. You see, okay, this person enslaved people who fit my ancestors' attributes. Now you're narrowing your list of potential enslavers. And finally, and most importantly, I promise I'm done here, you're going to review this potential enslaver's antebellum probate records and deeds. So not just theirs, you want to look at their in-laws' probate records and deeds. You want to look at their grandparents, their parents' probate records and deeds to determine if they devised, bequeathed, inherited, sold, or purchased your ancestors. And so what often was the case is that families would be transferred together, right? So you know your ancestor is Dan, but this record will show, okay, Sarah and Bob and their child Dan and his sister Rachel, so on and so forth. So that is how you trace families before emancipation. And just real quick, shout out to estate inventories. Everyone thinks I'm going to look at the will of this potential enslaver, but actually a will might say, okay, I'm going to give a third of my estate to my wife, I'm going to give a third of my estate to my son, I'm going to give a third of my estate to my daughter, but it won't even mention what enslaved people were included in that division. Inventories, on the other hand, list every single person who was included in this enslaver's estate. And in my humble opinion, estate inventories are the most underutilized and the most important record that we have for tracing enslaved families. So that's how you do it.
I don't know if you all could see, but my pen was writing furiously as I was trying to take as many notes as possible. Like, okay, so now I know estate inventories, that's the way to go. But right. So I know people may be wondering how poetry comes into all this. I want to make this connection to Remica, and I know that you two work together to do some research with her and her family. So I'd like to bring Remica in. Can you talk a little bit about this research and you and Noah and what was done and what you found?
I mean, first, I just owe a huge debt of gratitude to the entire panel because I was doing my own research on Ancestry.com on a project that I'm working on for the past 7-8 years. I've been working on this book. Teri introduced us all. This panel was supposed to happen at a different time, and I kind of jumped on poor Kyle and said, Kyle, please help me. I am desperate. I need information about my ancestress, my third great-grandmother, Minnie Folks. And Kyle said, oh, I know who can help you. So Kyle sent the information to Noah. So just a little bit of background on Minnie Folks. I'm writing a section of poems on her. The reason that I had any idea about this ancestress at all was because she was one of the few formerly enslaved folks that was interviewed for the WPA slave narratives back in the 1930s. Her narrative is really long. It's uncharacteristic for lots of reasons. She was one of the very, very few who was interviewed by a Black woman in the neighborhood. So she was very comfortable with the interviewer. So she said all kinds of crazy things that you wouldn't expect, except you would if your grandmother was in her 80s and just got to say whatever she wanted to say, right? But she also gave all of this information. She threw out information about her enslavers, information about really horrible things that happened on the plantation, information about her children. But most of it I couldn't corroborate. I just didn't know how. And so that was when Kyle and Noah come into play. Now, everything that Noah just said, I hope you guys saw my eyes like popping open at every turn, because he just revealed all his secrets to me. Like, that's how you did it. So I sent the information to Kyle and Noah. Long story short, Noah was able to find 3 generations of family back to the early 1800s, back to Minnie's grandmother. This would be my 5th or 6th great grandmother, that I would have never been able to find, because 1865 was the wall for me, as it is for most Black Americans. But so all those things that kind of Noah just said, they sent me back this treasure trove of information, and now have forced me to write at least 5 more books, I bet. But fortunately, like, kind of filled in so many of the spaces that are often left out when, amateurs like myself, I'm a writer, I'm a poet, I teach at Old Dominion. And I am deeply invested in African-American history. It was even, one of my, it was my minor in college. But I'm in no way a genealogist. It's not my life's work like it is for Noah. So the Ancestry.com folks have really helped me kind of narrow in and create this expansive family tree. And from some of the things that Noah sent, I was able to kind of get hints about things, places where I should be looking. And I didn't even get to tell Kyle and Noah this yesterday, but I found 2 other generations on my mother's side now too. So I'm back a little bit further because of all of your work. So thank you so much.
And that brings me to how poetry intersects with all of this. And so I'd like to take this moment to have our 2 poets read their work. So Remica, since we just had you on talking about your work, can you go ahead and read the poem that you have? And then we'll go to Paula, and Paula to read her poem too. And then we can talk a little bit more about the ways that poetry kind of intersects and how we get to poetry creating these stories.
Okay. So poetry for me is the way that I kind of flesh out mini narratives that have lots of holes, right? So this is one of the first times in a book of poems where I'm really trying to do some interesting family history. 2 of my ancestors, one on my maternal and paternal side, crossed paths in 1941 in Petersburg, Virginia. So I'm tracing their lives. This poem has little snippets of things that actually came from the research that Noah and Kyle helped uncover about many folks, my grandmother. So she was born in 1859. This poem is set in 1874 when her mother died during childbirth, and Minnie was being trained at that time to be a midwife. So I imagine that she was one of the ones who was there while her mother passed. So this is Putting Mother in the Ground, 1874. Children give, children take. I hold the baby loud and wailing, who's just slipped out of mama, who ferries her into the afterlife. Daddy on the other side of the door, howling like the baby when he finds mama's gone. They ain't had long enough to be together in peace. She never made 30, been having babies since 13. Got 8 of us through, praise God. Those of us left cry loud and long. No one has to say, hush now, don't let them hear you. I am 15, married, learning to aid with birthing. Granny come, Miss Missy, and I'm taught no one can save everyone. We get the child here, my sister, and all but one step back into the just showing light of morning. We put mother in the ground, out in the open. We'll mark her grave and visit. My body doesn't know yet, I'll birth 11 children. Illness will get many, only 7 will survive. The ones to bury me will bear the biggest burden. They'll dream of me until they rest. I'll be as heavy as eternity. With mother's baby wailing, these days she's been alone, I feel my first child moving in me. Have they come for each other? Sown through us, they want us all, mother, grandmother, sister. The earth turns over without much coaxing. Men tamp it down, the box disappearing. Children turn in my arms, in my belly. I am here and in between.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that reading and for that poem. And I like what you said about poetry fleshes out like the holes. It kind of gives body to the skeleton. But then once that skeleton is there and in your mind, I'm sure it has questions and I'm sure it's hungry for information. So that leads us to Paula. Paula, could you please read your poem? Oh, Paula, you're muted. Unmute her.
Yes, and thanks. And it follows on fairly naturally from Remica's poem and from the previous conversation, because where I come from in Dublin is that's some very small, maybe 5 or 6 square city blocks, which was the biggest red light district in Europe at the turn of the century into the 20th century. And it was the garrisoned soldiers, the docks of the second city of empire, a heavily garrisoned area. And that was the trade. And of course, that never came to me in what was a virtual theocracy that the Republic became here in Ireland. I didn't get those stories through the family, our connection into that area. I just got hints and glimmers. But the written record offered no hope, really, because nobody told truth to power where I came from. Nobody's going to say who's in the house when they're filling out the census forms. So my journey was between the folklore, which came at me through the folklore projects of the inner city, and the written record, somehow to manage through that chasm to find a truth I could embody in poems. So this is called The Hungry Ghosts, and it examines those circumstances of trying to find your way through the stories that grow tales and the written records that's unreliable. There are folk who have skeletons in their cupboards. I have a warehouse full of them, stacked to the rafters, my army of the dead. This be my ossuary. I pick over the bones, I sift through the ancestors, skull by cluttered skull, from the burial pits of the archives, item by scant item. In the chasm, secreted between the folklore and the paper trail, a zone where truth is hard got, if got at all or ever. Young, I'd wondered where spirit goes when from flesh it severs, and why in the chambers of my pulsing heart, the music was a mourning song, a dirge, an art sublime that might have laid the hungry ghosts to rest. Once after a poetry reading in a Midland town, a woman collared me, urgent, earnest. She'd eyes intense, near black of darkest brown, and this she said: your dead were with you on that stage, the young dead, the old dead, shades of every age, babies, crones, toddlers, those in their day, the unborn. I might have unleashed an habitual scorn of such nonsense, but for a look that flitted across her face, but for the darkness, but for the light, but for the grief I found in her clairvoyant eyes in a Midland town on a winter's night. And so I listened as the chairs were stacked and the caretaker swept the aisles. They are lonely. They come to hear you. You are wrapped in their affection. They need your poems like spells to unbind them from attachment to our world. She turned and left, and to this very day I feel that what she said was a summons, a flag unfurled in newfound territory, a common wheel between the here and now, the then and there, that I might yet come to settle and find peace, a state of mind, in mind, between the written and the heard, where truth is always tantalizing, there, just beyond my reach.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paula. I want to ask you, Paula, and then you, Remica, like, What role does poetry play for you when you begin to think about ancestry, when you begin to think about family history? And are there subjects that you feel like you can't reach even now, or things that you want to hold back on?
Well, I think it tends for me to come in waves, that I'll get a wave of research that will open up new territory that eventually gets funneled into the poems, or that I hit an emotional note in a poem that I've no reference for in my life, or what I know of my family, that I go and seek. Where is that emotional resonance coming from? And it's often coming from a silence. You know, you mentioned the 13-year-old. I found my great-grandmother's birth certificate, and she was 13, and she must have been pregnant, because 7 months later she gave birth, which was quite unusual in the tenements of the inner city of Dublin, in that area where diphtheria and typhoid racketed through, tuberculosis. So I found her as a 13-year-old at the altar, pregnant. And I found this in the middle of a life that was mostly spent under a kind of a theocracy here in Ireland, you know, where the influence of the church was so pervasive in education, in health, that these stories, they vanished. So they just held on in small little pockets. And I think some of the destiny of poetry is to be able to go into those places and unearth the huge emotional truths of traumatized communities.
And so let me just follow that up too. And I know, Remica, I want you to answer that too, but I want you both to, if you can, do you feel as if writing these poems, does it become therapy? Does it become a balm for the emotional wounds that sometimes this research may open?
Paula?
Yeah, I don't know, you know, that definitely poetry can have a therapeutic charge. And, you know, like dreams, I think we can't carry poems for our communities. They mightn't heal us, but we might be carrying that dream or that poem for someone else and for your community, because I believe we make them almost, you know, unaware of some of the implications of what we're saying. I found a line in one of the earliest poems I'd written, and I thought it was prescient. I said, you know, I was talking about just rambling around Dublin, hearing, it's a poem called Echoes, ghosts of my childhood dreaming. I had no idea what that line meant. And I think when you're a young poet, you mightn't understand the implications of what you're telling yourself or anyone else. But now I see that there was always this urge to try and touch those ghosts and make sense of the hauntings that I felt in my family and in the wider community.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Paula. So I'll answer the questions maybe in reverse, Teri. And so do I think poetry is therapy? No, I think therapy is therapy, and we should probably all do that too. But you know, it's been useful for me. But I think poetry certainly, poetry for me is how I ask questions, right? And not just like generalized questions. It's how I ask questions of, you know, people who can no longer give me answers, of ancestors and of those around us. It's how I ask questions of faith and of God. It's how I ask questions that I just have no way of reconciling on my own without further in-depth investigation, right? And so I don't think it's therapeutic when I'm able to kind of like process some of the things that I found in poems, but it does help me get a little closer to the answer to those questions. You know, and so that for me is really useful, because those questions, you know, if you're an artist, they nag at you forever. They never let you go, right? Until you find a way to kind of address them. And for me, the way is to plot it out in poems. But, you know, I think poets often get a bad rap too, like Paula talked about, you know, like the emotional feeling, like people think poets come to the page and they're just like, whatever you feel, you write down. And that might be where you start. But for me, research has always been a huge part of the process, right? Even Paula's, you know, talk of, you know, getting stuck at the emotional resonance. Like maybe I haven't had an experience large or wide enough to get at what I'm trying to address in the poem. but often it's just like filling in the historical holes that the poem leaves, right? Or even something that I'm trying to address that I only know the half of it. You know, research for me, you know, when I write poems, they're an outline, and research helps grow the poems up and give them a face. So that's how I find, you know, research has always been useful to me. Now, working on like family historical and ethnographic work, research is imperative. I can't write this book, Room Swept Home, the book that I'm writing about my grandmothers, without having some of those points of reference at hand. So right now, this book, this kind of work doesn't come to be without research at the helm. Yeah.
And I'm so glad you mentioned research, and thank you, Paula and Remica, for your incredible answers. So this makes me want to bring Kyle into the conversation. And Kyle, we talked about researching and hitting that hump of 1865 if you're, you know, researching and you're Black in America. But what about researching family history in Ireland? And are there, you know, what's unique about researching family history in Ireland? And once we get to that, I'd also like to bring in those connections between researching Irish ancestry and researching African-American ancestry, and if there are connections between the two.
Yeah, thank you. I think what Remica was just saying was really interesting for me to hear, because I think with family history research, we can learn a certain amount, but there's also a lot we can't learn from the records. So we don't want to leave out either one. We want to find out as much as we can from the records of the written reality, as true or not as it might be, depending on how people answered the questions, and then fill in the holes. But we also, on the other hand, we don't want to just leave out what the records say and go without them, because it's a foundation. So that's we see that a lot in our research. In terms of what kind of makes Irish research unique, it's also interesting you just mentioned 1865, because 1864 is a really important date for Irish history and research, because it's when civil registration of births, marriages, and deaths started in Ireland, very late, much later than in many other countries. And so before that time period, this is one of those parallels between African American and Irish research. You have to get a lot more creative and dig into things that are less commonly used in other countries and in family history. So church records, landed estate papers of the landlords, another parallel where you know, the average person in Ireland, well, 99% of people in Ireland didn't own land. They were all tenants of someone else. And so in order to get back earlier than, you know, maybe the 1830s or 1840s with your research, you have to identify who the landlord was. It's definitely not the same situation as identifying who a slaveholder was, but there is some common research process where you're trying to figure out, okay, who were the people who owned the land that my ancestors lived on? Who were these people? Where did they live? A lot of them lived in England and never came to Ireland, but they created records like rent rolls and leases, and so you try to figure out, well, where would those have been deposited around the world? Because really, the bottom line is that Irish research tends to be more difficult than, for example, England or Scotland or France, because of several reasons that kind of revolve around the survival of records. One of the big things that happened was that in 1922, during the Irish Civil War, the Public Record Office was destroyed. And so a lot of this state-generated records, like censuses, were destroyed. So we don't really have any censuses before 1901 in Ireland, which means we have to use alternative sources. Another big part of it is religious strife in Ireland, because after the Reformation in England and Ireland, the state church, the official church, was Protestant or Anglican. whereas most of the people, the regular folks, remained Roman Catholic. So the Roman Catholic Church, I mean, Paula talked about how strong the Roman Catholic Church was in the 20th century, but in the 17th century, it was very weak, and it had no resources. There was a lot of persecution. So for that reason, we don't have records as early for Catholic families as we do in other countries. And then 1922 comes, and at least half of the Protestant records go up in smoke. So those are some of the challenges that we come at with Irish research. It doesn't make it impossible. It just means that we have to dig deeper and use other records and be more creative. There are some really great things about Irish research, like there are some very detailed tax records that we use instead of the censuses that not only list people, but they list the exact plots of land that they lived on. So, and they have great maps that go along with them. So you can very often go to Ireland and set foot on the exact piece of property that your ancestors lived on and see, is the house still there? What fields did they have? And that is kind of an ultimate experience in Irish genealogy. And one other thing I would say is that we also have to, I think it's important to keep in mind another group of people in Ireland who were the Scots-Irish, and particularly because a huge number of the Scots-Irish immigrated to America in the 1700s, and particularly to the American South. And they were kind of a third group of people who had been in the lowlands of Scotland in the 1600s, and then they were kind of imported into the northern province of Ulster in Ireland in the 1700s because they wanted more non-Catholics there. And then they came in droves to America in the 1700s. They were primarily Presbyterian in religion. But when you think about what Irish immigrants you might have connections to in the American South, hugely Scots-Irish in character. So that's really important to keep in mind. And unfortunately, the Presbyterian records in Ireland are not really much better than the Catholic records. So again, we have to look at additional sources to kind of, there's this whole black hole in the 18th century for Irish research. Before that, there are good records. After that, there are fairly good records. But the 18th century is a hard time period to breach. I'd say, DNA is a big thing now with genealogy, and that in various ways offers us some new tools to use in trying to figure out specific places in Ireland and going back further in history, and connecting to the history of particular surnames and families. But the bottom line is that a lot of names in Ireland, if you know anything about Irish names, are very common. So, everyone's named Mary and Patrick, and half the people are Kelly or Murphy. So that creates some difficulties too. But there are other names, depending on what you're looking at. Like I have an ancestral line called Braniff. And everyone named Braniff is from the Ards Peninsula of County Down. So that's a really specific, helpful piece of information. So that's just a bit of information on, kind of what's unique about Irish research. And then we talked a little bit about the parallels with African-American research. And I'd say another one is there's a certain amount of lack of registration of marginalized people. They don't necessarily make it into the records that other people do. And we deal with that a lot in both groups, whether it's in America or Ireland. And certainly concern about what does the government want to know and what are they going to do with that information? We talked about this a little bit as we were starting. That's definitely a thing. So yeah, some interesting parallels between the experiences of African Americans and the Irish, as we see in other areas of their lives.
And you mentioned, Kyle, DNA. So I'd like to get you and Noah's thoughts on DNA and getting DNA testing as kind of a leaping off point for ancestral research? And once you get that done, what are your next steps once you say, and is it more important to get, and is it more important to have the DNA research done on your maternal side or on your paternal side? Which one is easier to follow? So those are all my questions.
Yeah, Noah, do you want to go with that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, just responding to something Remica said about how you sort of need the research to do the poetry. The reverse is completely true, right? The poetry is the passion. The poetry is why I do this. You don't have the research without the passion, without the poetry. So I did not even touch on, right, how you identify your Irish ancestors as a Black person in America. And the answer is first and foremost through an ancestry DNA autosomal DNA test. As you said, 25. This is the SparkNotes version. 25% of the African American genome nowadays is European. So what you're going to do, how you're going to start is you're going to review your DNA matches. You're not going to know most of them, but you'll know some of the closest matches that appear. Right, you might know, okay, this is a first cousin on my dad's side. This is a second cousin through my maternal grandmother. And so the important step here is called clustering, right? So you look at your second cousin on your maternal grandmother's side, and you review their shared matches. Well, if there's shared matches with the second cousin on your maternal grandmother's side, then 9 times out of 10 they're necessarily related through your maternal grandmother. And so you'll assign them all a color. Ancestry has a feature whereby you can cluster people using certain colors. You'll assign all maternal grandma's matches a color. You'll do the same with all of your grandparents if you can. Next step, you're going to try to do this with your great-grandparents. So you'll look at your third cousins related through one of your great-grandparents, so one of their siblings' great-grandchildren. And you'll say, okay, all of this match's shared matches are necessarily related through this great-grandparent of mine. We won't even talk about endogamy here. We won't talk about intermarriage between relatives in these small plantation towns in the South, which can really hinder some of this research. I won't go into that. But so you're clustering your matches and you're looking at your third cousin's, shared matches and thus who's related to your great grandparent. And you determine that a significant number of shared matches with this third cousin are white, right? And so you're like, okay, this is my connection to my most recent white ancestor. So then what you're going to do is you're going to look at all of the family trees for the white matches in this DNA cluster. Your goal is to identify their most recent common ancestor. I say it really fast, it takes a long time. So these family trees could be very minuscule, and so you're going to have to do some research into these DNA matches family trees yourself in order to identify their common ancestor with the other folks in this cluster. But ultimately, after much research, you're going to determine that the common ancestor for this cluster is Ben Jones, who lived in Columbia County, Georgia, and during the antebellum era. And then, based on how much DNA Ben Jones's descendants share with you, you can plug there are various calculators you can use to determine their possible genetic relationships. And based on these calculations, you can hypothesize as to their relationship to your great-grandparent or whatever cluster they fall into. So I mean, you can be done there and you can draw some, and especially if it turns out that your great-grandparent is also from Columbia County, where Ben Jones was from, right? But if you want to take it a step further, what you're going to do is you're going to review the antebellum era probate records and deeds, just as we talked about in the first half, for this common ancestor of your white matches. And you're going to determine if they bequeathed, inherited, purchased, or sold that particular great-grandparent family. So that is the methodology for identifying your most recent white ancestor. How to then identify that white ancestor's most recent Irish ancestor, I have no idea. So that's what Kyle does. Yeah.
So we do have a quick question. We have a few questions. I'm not sure if we'll be able to get to all of them, but one that's really simple was one person asked, is there, well, actually, I'll read the statement from Ann Davison, and Ann writes, genealogy has informed my fictionalized events in my family's past. It explained why my grandfather was the way he was. He disengaged from his children when they reached the age of 12. His father died when my grandfather was 11. His mother died 1 year later when he was 12. It's informed my writing about him. His experience has made me have more compassion in telling his story. And I would recommend writers research their family trees. So thank you, Anne, for that comment. I think that's a great point, and I think that gets to the heart of our conversation today. Then there's another question from Francie, and this brings information I don't know as much about, but it's asking a little bit about, has anyone explored the existing historic records maintained in Dublin that delineate key identity data for each shipped Irish enslaved individual to trace their existing Caribbean relatives? So I asked that of Noah and Kyle, and that is looking at the Caribbean and Irish connection and if there are ways for people to find that information out.
Yeah, there certainly were quite a lot of people from Ireland who were deported to the Caribbean. And there was intermarriage between the Irish and people of African descent, places like Montserrat. And there has been quite a bit of study of this, both from the historical records point of view and from the DNA point of view. So it's a pretty complex topic, but there is a lot out there to draw on, and I'd be happy to talk about that, further for a specific example. But yes, it's a fascinating area of inquiry to see how all that unfolded in the Caribbean on various islands, and what the relationships between the Irish immigrants and people of African descent were there. The records in Dublin, I don't think that there's by any means complete records of people who were sent. There are some records, but it was a chaotic period. And I don't know that keeping records of every single person who was being deported was all that important. I mean, there are records of trials and court records and that sort of thing for individual people, but it's a complex area of research.
Well, thank you, Kyle, and thank you, Noah, for those answers. And we're at a point to wrap up here. I want to thank all of our audience and their rapt attention, but I also really want to thank our poets, Paula Meehan and Remica Bingham-Risher. If you can see it, please support living poets and buy their work. Always important to support living poets and buy their work. And I would also like to ask Noah and Kyle, if people wanted to get in contact with you, can they do so? I know that Noah and Kyle were so helpful with one of our poets, Remica, so I know other people may have other requests. How best can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, absolutely. We're happy to help. Best thing to do would be to go to our website, probably, which is progenealogists.com. Spelling and pronouncing that could be hard, but you can also just actually, an easier thing to do could also be to go to ancestry.com, and there's a hire an expert button there, which takes you to the progenealogist website. So either one of those works.
And I know there have been a couple questions about whether or not this recording will be available at a later date. It will be. For everyone who registered for this event, you will have access to it at another time, and it will be available. So again, thank you, Paula, Kyle, Remica, Noah, and Brendan, Maria, and so many others for making this hour of conversation possible. And I hope that people will continue to look into their family ancestry. And if you haven't begun to do this, please do record your elders. It has been so beneficial to me as a poet to have recorded conversations with my grandmother and my great aunt before they passed. So I just want to put that little nugget out there. Now's the time to record that elder before it gets too late. So again, thank you all for your time and for your expertise and for your enthusiasm and for your brilliant words. I really appreciate it. And I hope that our audience out there did as well. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening. And I'll see some of you in 30 minutes when we start our workshop, where we will get a chance to talk about the 2 poems that were read here. So again, thank you all and have a good afternoon.